Hey guys, Sean here, and welcome to the F1 Word. Now, at the Canadian Grand Prix, Lando Norris's race came to a catastrophic end as he hit the back of Oscar Piastri, costing him a hefty 12 points to his teammates in the race for the 2025 Drivers' World Championship. But although his weekend ended in disaster, there may actually be a silver lining that could save Lando Norris' F1 title hopes. But before we get to that, a few words on the incident itself. A rarity in Formula One, but there's not really all that much controversy here given that Lando Norris immediately took full responsibility for it, and so I've not really got a huge amount to add about the incident itself. It was 100% his mistake, and so in the words of the stewards, he was solely to blame for the collision. I have got to give him credit for holding his hands up, but at the same time, Piastri did nothing wrong, so what else could he do? And yeah, whilst good, brace yourself for some more exceptional analysis. The apology and acceptance doesn't bring back the points he lost. Post-race, Norris was handed a 5-second time penalty by the stewards, which, given that he didn't reach the checkered flag, has upset a few people on the old social media. I know, angry people on social media, who'd have thought it? To clarify, that penalty has been served and won't convert into a grid drop for Austria because Lando was a classified finisher, having completed more than 90% of the race, and so he can have and has had the 5 seconds added to his race time. Yes, it's another one of those classic FIA wording things, but I've got to admit it is a bit ridiculous that he got a penalty that didn't actually penalise him in the end, something I often say about grid drops for drivers in last place, to be fair, and it's also a little strange that there were no penalty points either. Then again, some of you might argue that the collision, effective retirement and the points lost was punishment enough for the collision, but that's not generally how the rules are supposed to work. The incident was, though, another example of where Norris needs to improve if he wants to win a world championship, not just this year, but at any stage in his career. It was another weekend with mistakes that left him on the back foot, with his error at the final chicane in his first run in Q3 piling the pressure onto his second run, which, whilst obviously better, wasn't good enough to see him in a mix for pole position and left him well out of position on the grid. That itself then adds even more pressure to his race, and that forces the team and himself to try something different and go aggressive in order to make up the places. And in the races, he also needs to be getting these overtakes done much more quickly. Yes, I know, easier said than done, rather than allowing the pressure to build. The longer it takes, the more likely it is that a driver makes a mad lunge or, as we saw on Sunday, tries to overtake via a gap that at no point even existed. Also, still on the subject but slightly off to the side, it's a tad baffling as to why Norris needs his engineer to tell him that he will have a better shot at passing Piastri if the Aussie doesn't have DRS. Isn't that something the driver should know already? I suppose, though, it's all encouragement and a big part of driver coaching. And to be honest, as someone who loves to state the obvious from time to time, and that's an understatement, I very much sympathise with Lando and his engineer there. But although, of course, I'm critical of the collision, I think everybody is, I'm not going to do what so many others will and start kicking him whilst he's down and piling on. It was a mistake, a silly and unnecessary one, yes, but it's a mistake he took full responsibility for and must learn from going forward. That's it. Perhaps surprisingly, though, it might not be all doom and gloom for Norris. Yes, really. That positive for Norris that could save his title hopes comes in the form of an update he ran in Montreal. Now, the Brit has been pretty open about this year's McLaren not being to his liking, and definitely not in the same way the 2024 car seemed to suit him. And as ever, there are about 7 million different theories out there as to why that might be the case. But one idea was that McLaren's decision to move the steering arm of the suspension further forward for this year ended up having a knock-on effect, which ultimately negatively impacted his feel for the front end of the car. Of course, only Lando and McLaren will know for sure, but it is interesting that the team arrived in Canada with an update to the front suspension, which was designed to enhance the feedback from the steering and brakes, and an update, of course, that Norris jumped at the chance to run, but Oscar Piastri, who hasn't suffered with the 2025 car's front end in the same way, chose to avoid. That tweak to Norris's car may well have been the reason why he seemed to just about have the edge over his teammate earlier in the weekend, before those qualifying mistakes I mentioned earlier kicked in. But that is only a sample size of one qualifying session and one race where he was out of position, so we'll have to wait and see if that update does help in Austria in a couple of weeks' time. If it does help to give Lando a better and more comfortable feel behind the wheel, it could swing things a little bit more in his direction, and that is the positive, the silver lining if you like I mentioned. The car moving more towards his liking might bring him into play between now and the end of the season. However, even if that does end up being the case, right now it is certainly advantage Piastri. The Aussie left Montreal with a 22-point lead over his teammate, 3 points shy of essentially having a race win in his pocket. He may not have had the perfect weekend at the circuit Gilles Villeneuve himself, but he didn't make the mistakes his teammate made at critical points of the weekend, and with everything that happened, gained a potentially crucial 12-point swing. At any point in what is expected to be a tight title fight, that is a massive swing. Sure, Piastri did hit the wall in practice, but bounced back immediately, and in the race, much like his teammate, looked a brief threat to the leaders, a very brief threat in the latter stages, until he came across Kimi Antonelli, who he struggled to pass, and then, well, we all know what happened from there. Look, I've got to be honest, it is bizarre to me that nobody seems to be talking much about the Aussie despite his extremely strong start to 2025. The guy has won half of the races so far, has been on the podium at 8 of the opening 10, and outside of practice mistakes has only quite literally slipped up at one race, and that was all the way back at the season opening Australian Grand Prix. He's been excellent so far, and I can't help but feel, and frankly, I'm pretty confident I know based on how this has gone in the past, if his name was Verstappen, Hamilton, Norris, or even Leclerc, for example, everyone would be waxing lyrical about this up-and-coming hotshot superstar driver who is having the season of his life to this point. Instead, it's all McLaren versus Verstappen. Why is Hamilton struggling? And Norris the bottle job, Norris and his mistakes, Norris and what he had for breakfast a week last Thursday. The guy is leading the championship for goodness sake and deserves a huge amount of credit for the big step forward he's taken over the winter and how consistent he has been. And now I'm going to be a massive hypocrite and talk about Norris again, but it is an important point to make. He is making some huge mistakes as already covered, and he's never going to win a title against the likes of Piastri, Verstappen, whoever, if he doesn't iron those mistakes out. It has been suggested, though, by a few people that perhaps Lando's errors and struggles with the car are making Oscar's season look even better than it is, as in, with those issues, he's letting his teammate off the hook. I do think that's a fair point to make, and there is probably an element of that. However, the car changed for both drivers over the winter, and Piastri adapted to it, as the best drivers tend to do, to deliver the opening 10 races he has managed to put together. He also isn't making the mistakes at crucial points that Norris is, and he seems mentally a lot stronger right now. Of course, as I often say, it's rarely just the one thing when it comes to F1, and so saying Norris' struggles have given Oscar a better shot at building that gap may well be an element of what is going on here, but that does a disservice to just how good Piastri has been. I'll say it again, he is not making the mistakes his more experienced teammate is making when it matters, and that deserves so much more respect and credit than he's getting, frankly. What now, though, for Piastri, Norris and McLaren? Well, team orders won't be on the cards anytime soon, with team boss Andrea Stella ruling that out post-race, and rightly so. Yes, I know, it is a team sport too, and the Constructors' title does pay out the cold hard cash, but that one is, realistically at least, in the bag for the Woking team, and so leaving the drivers to battle for the drivers' title is the right thing to do. Just imagine if they'd ordered Piastri out of the way on Sunday, giving Norris at least a 2-point gain on his teammate, and then Piastri loses the title by a single point in Abu Dhabi. No thanks. The very short and very much paraphrased version of what the team are saying is, you are free to race, but don't crash into each other, and that seems reasonable. As for the drivers, Norris needs to get his head in the game, simple as that, put the major disappointment and big mistake in Canada behind him and bounce back in Austria with a very strong weekend performance and lots of points. And as mentioned a couple of times already, he ultimately needs to stop making these mistakes immediately, really. After all, it's okay appearing to be the quicker of the two drivers, but it soon becomes irrelevant if you can't bank a good quali lap and then hit the back of your teammate on race day. As I say, you've got to put the whole weekend together. Piastri, though, he really just needs to keep doing what he's doing. And if the updates do help Norris to start taking points away and turn his fortunes around, he needs to make sure he limits the damage on those weekends. Yes, a 22-point lead is very nice, but it can soon disappear. He has got that buffer to play with, and that's great. And so he can start thinking of the bigger picture now and maybe even channel his inner Alain Prost if he has one. That is it for this one then, but let me know down in the comments what you made of the incident in Canada and who are you backing for the 2025 World Championship title now we've had 10 races. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.